So, you probably remember seeing the headlines a few years ago, right? This idea of a mandatory $100,000 salary for every single H-1B worker. I mean, it sounded like a massive, game-changing shift in U.S. immigration. But here's the twist. That's not really what went down. So in this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain and separate the myth from the reality.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by jumping right into that whole 100K myth. Then we'll get into what was actually being proposed. We'll look at the big arguments, both for and against, figure out why the rule just vanished, and then see what the current approach is. And we'll wrap it all up with a final key takeaway.
All right, let's do it. First things first, let's talk about that number. You know, the one that got everyone talking and caused all that controversy.
Yep, there it is, $100,000. When that figure splashed across the news, you just couldn't miss it. And for a lot of people, the knee-jerk reaction was, whoa, so that's it? A new universal salary floor for every single H-1B worker, period? But was it really that straightforward? A flat, mandatory minimum salary for every person with an H-1B visa?
Well, not exactly. The real story is, a lot more complicated. And honestly, maybe the biggest spoiler here is the rule doesn't even exist anymore. So let's unpack what was actually going on.
See, the policy that kicked all this off wasn't really a new minimum wage at all. It was a huge change to something called the prevailing wage.
Okay, so what's the prevailing wage? Basically, it's a standard the government uses to make sure hiring foreign workers doesn't drive down local wages. It's calculated based on the specific job and, crucially, the location. So, of course, a software engineer in Silicon Valley is going to have a way higher prevailing wage than one in a smaller city.
And this is where that $100,000 figure comes from. Just look at this jump. Under the old system, an entry-level H-1B role had to be paid above the 17th percentile for local salaries. The proposed new rule jacked that all the way up to the 45th percentile. For certain jobs, like a software engineer in a big tech hub, that leap alone was enough to push the required salary past that $100,000 mark. So it wasn't a flat rule for everyone, but an effect of this massive change.
Now, the official goal from the Trump administration was pretty clear: protect American jobs. The thinking was, if you force companies to pay way more, they'll only use the H-1B for super specialized roles they just can't fill locally. It was meant to stop companies from using the visa as a way to find cheaper labor. As you can imagine, a change this big immediately kicked off a firestorm of debate. Let's get into the arguments on both sides.
So the folks in favor said this was a long overdue correction. They argued it would directly stop American workers from being replaced by lower-paid H-1B employees. Plus, they said it would filter the program to attract only the absolute top-tier global talent and kind of level the playing field against firms that were accused of gaming the lottery by just flooding it with tons of low-wage applications.
But wow, the opposition was intense. They said, look, crucial places like startups, universities, and hospitals, they just can't afford these kinds of salaries. It would kill innovation. They also warned that the best talent would just go to other countries. And then there was their final, and as it turned out, most powerful argument, that the rule itself was pushed through illegally without following the proper procedures.
So, with all that heat, what was the final verdict? How did this whole thing shake out in the end?
So here's the bottom line, the most important thing to know. The rule we've been talking about is not in effect today. It got challenged, immediately.
And this timeline just shows how fast it all crumbled. The rule gets introduced in October 2020. By December, we're talking just 2 months later, a federal court had already thrown it out. Then, by 2021, the new administration just dropped the legal fight entirely.
Now, the court vacated the rule. And that wasn't about whether the policy itself was good or bad. It was a procedural thing. The court found that the administration had basically skipped a step. They rushed the rule through without the proper public comment period, which is required by law for a change this major.
Okay, so if that rule is gone, what's going on now? Well, the current administration has a totally different strategy.
Yeah, the current strategy is a whole different ballgame. Instead of one giant salary hike, the approach is much more targeted. First step, really crack down on fraud and abuse that's already in the system. And step 2, propose a totally new lottery. The idea is to move away from a random drawing to a system that actually prioritizes applicants with higher skills and higher salaries. The goal is kind of similar, but the method is way more nuanced.
So, after all of that, the headlines, the debates, the court battles, what's the one big thing we should take away from this whole saga?
One analysis really nailed it, calling the proposed rule a well-intentioned but overly blunt instrument.
And that really gets to the heart of it. The goal, preventing wage suppression and making sure the H-1B program is for the best of the best, that's a valid goal. But the method, this sort of one-size-fits-all giant wage hike, was seen as flawed. It would have created all this collateral damage, hurting vital sectors like research, healthcare, and all those up-and-coming tech startups.
And that really leaves us with the big question that policymakers are still wrestling with today. What is the best way to fix the system? Is it a high salary floor that acts like a hammer? Or is it a more targeted, prioritized lottery? That's the debate that's still very much alive. Thanks for digging into this with us.